the big picture of 2008, and I'm in finance because of what happened in 2008.
Right.
I was finishing my PhD, and I was actually directly affected because I was in Iowa at a state school, and I had another 6 to 8 months of funding left, supposedly, to work on my PhD, which is in history of technology, which is how I got involved in all of this. But because of the financial crisis in 2009, I actually got my funding pulled for a PhD program at the University of Iowa and wound up spending that last semester working as a short order cook, working as a parking lot attendant, teaching at the local community college, and finishing my PhD all at the same time instead of sitting on a nice stipend and doing nothing.
3 jobs to pay for it.
Right. So very personal for me. And at the high level, the 2008 crisis absolutely looks exactly like this, because you had these things called CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, which were built on top of mortgages and were essentially designed to keep banks safe when mortgages went down, but nobody was doing the math of like the total amount outstanding of these shared obligations. And so ultimately there was just not enough to cover when that actually happened. So in a lot of ways, it's similar to, if you think about like the Celsius token as some kind of financial instrument based on the returns from DeFi. If those returns turned out to not be there, then your Celsius token is worthless in some of the same ways that a CDO or a multi-tranche like mortgage-backed security turned out to be worthless in 2008. It's all about like promises that can't be fulfilled. You're making promises. If you're Alex Mashinsky, you're issuing that token, and that is a promise that there's going to be value here over the long term. And then if the financial mechanisms behind that actually don't work out, then that promise is worth nothing. And that's the very high level, I think, of both crises in a nutshell.
But also both crises get to the root of human greed and what human greed can do. Well, you combine human greed with leverage.
Yeah.
Again, a few small players can cause insurmountable damage to a large amount of people.
Yeah.
And I talk about, the reason I bring up the idea of regulation, which I know is heresy in Bitcoin land, but I don't just live in Bitcoin land. I also live in 2 worlds. I live in a world where I have a mortgage and savings and have family, I have friends, and I have plenty of friends who you're not going to be able to sell Bitcoin on an idea of complete deregulation, tiny government. You've got to go step by step. And there's this kind of contradiction whereby very critical of the state, very critical of central banks. They've caused the majority, if not all, the problems with regards to fiat currencies. This kind of decivilizational process we're kind of going through, they're entirely to blame. But at the same time, some regulations out there do actually protect people. And what is the right balance? There are going to be people who say, have a completely free, fair, open market, which I don't think solves anything. You can have a highly over-regulated market where the government have control of everything, which I also think is great. So, where is the line? For me, I don't know where that line is, but I'm interested in exploring that and interested in exploring what it means.
Yeah. Well, I would say 2 things first to just kind of like set the stage here, which is I think that the more time I spend just repeating this line, the more I find it compelling that like a perfect regime for me would be 0 upfront regulation, extremely fierce back-end enforcement on bad actors. That is a unrealistic scenario, I think, because ultimately it requires a lot of manpower to do that enforcement on the back end. And you'll have people kind of running into that machine all the time like a wood chipper. And ultimately, government funding for enforcement is always contingent on somebody's ability to cut that budget, right? So if an industry decides that they don't want that, they can just lobby enough to defund that department. So it's not a realistic scenario. But what I worry about with the front-end regulation, especially in crypto, is that there are a lot of smaller scale things that really could be useful experiments, and we need some kind of safe harbor where maybe if you're not dealing with a certain amount of money, or you have certain protections in place for all of your depositors, you can just go ham and do whatever you want. I mean, that would be ideal for me, because I think that there are really useful experiments that can get squashed by regulation. And I was listening to something today which reminded me that we have a really clear example in crypto of prediction markets, right? Like, prediction markets could have been a genuinely, it's you're not making any grand claims about what you're doing. It's just kind of gambling for fun mostly.
But kind of trying to give you information on what people think outcomes will be.
Yeah, and there is some like useful information that comes out of that. You still occasionally see a news piece written about what a particular prediction market is saying at this, that, or the third time, that's just impossible because of regulation. And so that, I think, is one thing that we've already lost out on because of some of the rules that are in place.
How's regulation prevented that from happening?
Well, because it is considered gambling. And so I think that, like, in terms of serving U.S. customers, I know that like Gnosis and Augur were both ICOs in 2017, 2018 that people were quite excited about. And Gnosis has managed to make it under a different business model, but Augur has kind of gone the way of the dinosaur because they just couldn't do the regulatory thing.
I thought there were some flaws I haven't looked at Augur for a while.
I mean, this is what we're talking to Paul Stork about tomorrow, because
Who
he
is
wants
it?
to do drive chains on Bitcoin, which allows prediction markets, I think.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
We'll have that conversation then.
So anyway, the protection innovation should be a priority. The second thing I was going to say, though, is that I will sort of remind people who are so staunchly anti-regulatory that, like, the SEC is not God and does not have infinite power. Like, it has a lot of power, and if you run afoul of it, you can definitely get into a lot of trouble that will impact your life in a big way, unless you're Elon Musk. But the other thing to keep in mind is that there are spaces beyond regulation. There are spaces beneath regulation. There is sort of international safe harbors that de facto exist for you to go and do stuff that you really believe in that might not work under a regulatory regime.
Or run away to when you've been busted.
Yeah, I mean, it's a double-edged sword for sure. But I guess my only point is just that, like, don't think that the SEC has total control over your life if you're doing something that is well-intentioned and genuine. Not to get anybody in trouble, but
so I listed some of the parts of the Dodd-Frank Act that came out in 2010 after the crisis, to just try and understand if there are things there that would be helpful. Not so much as a claim that I want Bitcoin to be regulated. I don't want Bitcoin to be regulated, but I do want to identify the things they tried to work on, which I thought was quite interesting, because I'll give you an example of self-regulation in Bitcoin that would be good. A lot of people have talked about proof of reserves with exchanges. Now, it's a lot of work, but that's good self-regulation. Now, if you had all the exchanges doing proof of reserves and the ones that didn't, that's your on-chain version of a Yelp review. It's like, okay, well, Coinbase has proved their reserves, and Kraken has proved their reserves, and Gemini have proved their reserves, but this little fucking, I'm not going to name any because I don't know any, but this, I don't know, one in Canada, for example, has not proved its reserve. Well,
right, that was when the discussion of proof of reserve got going, right?
Yeah, but that would be an example of some kind of self-regulation that would be good, because you can basically see which of the exchanges are operating the most, the best way. Now, that doesn't stop from a hack having funds stolen, but the point being is that's some part of self-regulation that would be good. Can we get there on everything? If we can get there on self-regulation, that would be great. But some of the things, so the Financial Stability Oversight Council is responsible for keeping banks and other financial firms from becoming too big to fail. So they required special annual tests to ensure that these large institutions were prepared for the inevitable arrival of recessions and future financial crises. So they run that test every year in a number of scenarios to make sure these banks can't fail. And I'm pretty sure I read about one, they ran one test a year, 2-3 years ago, and they actually found one failed that would fail under that scenario. So that's been a particularly good thing that I think that exists. I wonder if there are stress tests we can put into our system to see if it's too big to fail. But what are the things that are going to stop, which are, well, but then I say that, look, I'm going around in circles here, because you pointed out that Luna could fail. What was that, 68 billion in?
Nominally, yeah. It's not real money, but nominally.
Made up money. But The problem is, even with these things put in place, you could, unregulated, have self-regulation. These things still could fail.
Well, you don't even have to think about that in terms of regulation. Like proof of reserve should be a competitive point. I mean, you, especially with all of these failures, frankly, from exchanges and crypto, and I do mean crypto rather than Bitcoin, but the big picture, I mean, we're technologically very well positioned to have something like that level of transparency. And I think that should be the watchword. Like, it's very difficult if you have a hedge fund to, actually put everything on chain. You don't want that level of transparency because then people can see your trades and counter trade you, and it's a business strategy issue. But for those who aren't familiar, I guess, proof of reserves is this idea that you can use zero knowledge proofs and essentially like provide attestations at the high level without getting into the nitty gritty of exactly what you're doing. And that's, it's an exciting and interesting idea. And I would love to see, I think that once one exchange implements that, then instantly everybody else is going to as well.
Didn't one do it? Did
Kraken have done it, yeah.
Kraken
Oh, they have? Well, then I'm wrong.
I think some more have done it as well.
But it's not like it's something we talk about, and it's not like I've heard anyone say, well, I don't use that exchange because they don't have proof of reserves.
Kraken,
I think it's a
CoinFloor, Gate.io, BitMEX, HBDC, BTC, and Ledin.
Oh, that's great.
Gate.io. I'm pretty sure.
BitMEX, that's a good one.
I'm pretty sure back in 2017, I bought XRP on Gate. Shitcoin days.
God, confession
I bought
time.
like £300 of XRP in 2017. Yeah, the standard. But I've never heard, have you heard anyone say, well, I don't use that exchange, it doesn't have proof of reserve?
No, but I think you're right. I think it could be a competitive, like it would definitely.
Yeah, and it's a thing that you have to like over time sort of teach people about. I mean, we know about this because this is like something Nick Carter said 3 years ago, and like nobody other than people like us remembers it.
I think he wrote a paper on it, didn't he?
Probably. And Trace May used to talk about it, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
And I guess you could do a similar thing for the likes of your Celsiuses, your Voyagers, your BlockFis.
I mean, in theory, again, there are problems because not all of that is on chain, and you don't want it all to be too transparent. But yes, in theory, and ultimately, really something that you absolutely should expect from that kind of thing. Because, for example, we kept hearing this drumbeat of Celsius lost 50 million here, 100 million here, 200 million there, and eventually you do wind up with a $1.2 billion hole in your balance sheet.
But a proof of reserves wouldn't identify if they're doing some funky things in the background, which is
or off chain, or like 3AC taking these loans would totally be non-transparent. And this sort of gets to I think another kind of pillar of TradFi regulation that. It's tough to do in a self-regulatory environment, but one of the reasons Three Arrows was such a bad blow-up is because they were doing everything at the same time. They were doing, they were a hedge fund, they were an OTC desk, they were a prop shop, they were managing treasuries for startups, which is insane. And when you go back to Glass-Steagall, the reason that was important is because it prevented retail banks from also being investment banks. That was the basic, Chinese wall that set up.
And with the Volcker rule with Dodd-Frank, that would prevent banks from engaging in speculative trading activities.
Right. Exactly. And that's it's insane that anybody at any level ever thought this was okay,
You could put that in the place of someone like, you would say that if you had a Volcker rule for the likes of Celsius, they would have broken it.
They 100% were breaking it. Yes. Yeah. They were not just engaging in trading of speculative assets. They were a retail operation trading in completely unregulated assets. So it's like
Unhedged.
Your bank turned around and just bought a bunch of pink sheets from whatever the I'm forgetting the word for junk bonds.
Right.
So, it's on its face crazy.
You also have here that enables the Securities and Exchange Commission to regulate derivative trading or contracts between two parties to agree on a financial asset or set of assets. Well, the SEC are stepping in to try and do this now anyway.
I got to say, I'm not really totally understand the nuances of that provision because it sounds like you're regulating private contracts, which, I might just skip commenting on that one.
I was more focused on the regulate derivative trading, but then we had this other part of it, the Sarbanes-Oxley reformed corporate responsibility held CEOs personally responsible for accounting errors and gave protections to individuals who flag behavior, namely whistleblowers.
Right.
Again, yeah, you can see why these all existed following 2008. We blew up the world
Right,
economy.
yeah.
Requires hedge funds to register with the SEC.
Yeah.
So should and were 3AC registered?
Well, I mean, they were based in Singapore, so they were
okay.
they were registered in Singapore, I believe, and it did come out later, apparently, that they were only authorized in Singapore to be managing like $250 million. So they were breaking whatever law they were operating under, it seems, which gets to kind of another angle on this, which is you can regulate all you want, but there's a lot of character involved here too, and reputation does matter. But, whistleblower protections, all of these things are very important. I mean, personal liability. The other thing I will say, though, is that a lot of this stuff in theory does still apply to the likes of Celsius.
Right.
I mean, right now, we don't have to have a separate set of laws for crypto when you're just like, I'll take your US dollars and do something with it, right? Like that's all the same regulatory regime ultimately. And this is something else to reassure people who are on the Bitcoin end who are worried, is that a lot of this regulation would in theory fall not on the assets, not on the blockchains. I mean, we've had some scary stuff about wallet regulations, which like every sane person should be 100% against. Like
Unhosted wallets,
sacrosanct. Like you absolutely cannot regulate unhosted wallets. It's different discussion. Anyway, point being, a lot of these institutions were just that, institutions who were offering to manage money for you. There are already rules for that stuff. And I think it's going to come out that those rules that were already in place were being broken severely.